So first of all, I would like to thank the organizer. It's a great honor and pleasure to be today here. And I also would like to thank my co-author, Valery Ivanov from University of Michigan. What I'm going to present is how change of climate, mostly precipitation from year to year, so interannual variability, are going to affect vegetation performance and hydrological fluxes. So we want to understand if vegetation productivity in terms of GPP or MPP, so above ground net primary production of gross primary production, and evapotranspiration are sensitive, or if they are not sensitive to interannual variability of mostly precipitation. So then we want to understand what time scale control the annual variability in evapotranspiration and vegetation productivity, if there is a role of long-term memory in the system. The motivation behind came also from a series of studies, mostly in ecology, where they were showing a very strong correlation between above-ground net primary production and precipitation at the global scale. Mostly SALA for grassland in the Midwest of US, very strong correlation, but also successive studies that were showing correlation of this type through site of the long-term ecological research. So the motivation also comes from other studies that were looking into more short time per scale, and were finding that sometimes, for instance, William and Albertson, there was a strong correlation between water and carbon fluxes, annual precipitation in a system in Kalahari. There was other studies in more wet system that were showing basically the evapotranspiration is insensitive to precipitation, or studies that were showing a mixed behavior even given the same climate depending on the vegetation type. So the conceptual scheme that we frame our analysis, we will perturb somehow interannual variability of precipitation, and we have hypothesized three types of response at this point, where in the x-axis you have precipitation in the system, and in the y-axis you have either ET or above ground net primary production, so the explained variable. You may have hypothesized a sort of linear relationship, so if you change interannual variability, you increase, for instance, the variance, you will have no change in the mean, but a change in the variance of the other variable. Another case of nonlinear response, if you change interannual variability, you increase the variance, you are going to get a change in the variance, but also a change in the mean. Typically, with this shape, you will have a decrease in the mean, can be demonstrated mathematically. Then you have another type of behavior that is basically insensitive. If you change mean and variance, you get no basically response on the system. But before perturbing interannual variability, we ask ourselves how we define interannual variability of climate. So we did this study that was published 1 year ago in Journal of Climate, where we were analyzing the patterns of annual precipitation, and the first metric were basically it's expressing interannual variability is the coefficient of variation of annual precipitation. We analyzed for all the stations from the NCDC database, and we found a very smooth pattern from region to from low interannual variability, like for instance the East Coast in US, to a region of high interannual variability. Obviously, as you can see from this map, there is a correlation between mean precipitation and interannual variability of precipitation expressed as coefficient of variation, but the mean precipitation cannot explain more than 35% of the overall pattern. So we ask ourselves if statistically, from the statistical point of view, something else could explain this. And we came out with this relationship that if you include also seasonality in the picture, so this is precipitation concentration index, but whatever other type of seasonality index works, you find a very strong correlation between the coefficient of variation of annual precipitation and these two metrics, mean annual precipitation and seasonality. So it's basically that interannual variability is driven mostly by short-term anomalies of few months. They are going to affect the seasonality of the system. So systems that are more seasonal are also more prone to interannual variability. We also found from this analysis that short lag autocorrelation are very weak worldwide, but there is an intensity of long memory that is significantly different from zero. It's very difficult to compute long memory with a short time series, but we compare with a sort of white noise. We generate the same number of time series, the same length, and we found there is a bit of long memory into the system. So we decided to pick up 4 sites with different mean annual precipitation, different interannual variability, and different basically vegetation type. These are in California, in Arizona, in Michigan, and in Switzerland. These 4 sites are Black Hills near Tucson, with shrubs, deciduous evergreen shrubs, 350 millimeters of rainfall. The Vaira Ranch, it's a grassland, a Mediterranean climate near San Francisco, and the University of Michigan, it's a deciduous forest. We are going to a more mesic environment with 800 millimeters of precipitation and a lower coefficient of variation of interannual variability of annual precipitation, and also a grassland in Zurich that's really already a wet environment there. So for all this site, we have a flux tower where we will calibrate a model that I will explain in a while. And we use a nearby station to extend the climate to have a longer record. So sometimes the climate we used was not exactly the one measured at the flux tower. So the experiment we designed basically used two numerical tools, a weather generator and an eco-hydrological model. So we define 4 types of interannual variability in terms of a control scenario created by an autoregressive model where we have mean precipitation, coefficient of variation, and autocorrelation from the measured. Then a long-term persistency case where we impose a long memory to the system, actually a very high value of long memory, a bit higher than what was observed from the global scale. And 2 cases of increasing and decreasing variability, where we change the standard deviation of annual precipitation to get a coefficient of variation of plus 0.1 and minus 0.1. That, if you remember the map before, it's pretty a huge variation of interannual variability. So with this 4 scenario, we feed the weather generator. We generate 200 years of basically stationary climate. And we feed to an eco-hydrological model that was parameterized for the vegetation of these 4 sites through the flux tower. And we simulate hourly water, energy, and vegetation productivity. A step back for the tools, to describe the tools. The advanced weather generator, it's basically a stochastic tool where you feed the observed climate. It estimates the parameters through this climate. It can reproduce theoretically infinite time series of a climate that is statistically equivalent to the observed one. This weather generator can reproduce more than usual precipitation and temperature, but also solar radiation, divided in different bands, relative humidity, wind speed, atmospheric pressure. So it's the only existing hourly weather generator that I know. It's capable of reproduce from low frequency variability to extremes, and can simulate several different meteorological variables. What I can say about weather generator, this type of tool that can be tested immediately because you have observed data, they tend to perform very well. So the climate they simulate is very similar to observed one. Then in terms of eco-hydrological model, we use Tethys Chloris. There is a fairly comprehensive hydrological model where we explicitly simulate short wave, long wave radiation through the canopy. We have a complete energy budget solution. We estimate transpiration, evaporation through a resistance analogy scheme. Biochemical model of photosynthesis, stomatal aperture. We account for subsurface, saturated, unsaturated dynamics. This is thought to be a catchment scale model, but in these studies use at the plot scale. In terms of vegetation, the carbon that is assimilated through photosynthesis is either used for growth and maintenance respiration, or is allocated to different carbon pools in the plant, leaves, fruit and flowers, living sapwood, carbohydrate reserve, and fine roots. Then the different pools can undergo turnover due to drought and cold stress, to aging of the tissues, and everything is also controlled by phenology in terms of allocation and translocation of carbon. Basically, the vegetation dynamic is dynamic with regards to evolution and time of carbon pools, but there are a series of assumptions. Vegetation is always assuming a mature state, so we are not growing forest, we are not making species competition, there is no aging of the plants, no seed dispersion, mortality can occur only through basically carbon starvation. So these are all assumptions that could be critical for interannual variability. I would say yes, but we decide to start from here anyhow. So we are aware that this type of assumption may change the picture I'm going to present, but it's a starting point. So we confirm the model in the different site. Here I'm showing for UMBS, the deciduous forest, the daily cycle of radiation average in the 11 years period. These are the scatter plot. We are doing pretty okay here in this site, but this is not very surprising for a type of model like this. What is a little bit more surprising is to catch GPP daily very well. But even if we get almost, we explain 92% of GPP daily, we still catch the annual, but not that well. We do much better if we move to Vaira Ranch, where again we simulate a grassland, the daily time scale pretty well, and also very well the annual. I'm stressing the annual because this is typically a metric that every DGVMs is not really able to reproduce. We did some tests, and this is, in my opinion, a very important metric, especially if you want to do long-term prediction, but models are really failing. It's not shown very often, this type of metric. So if I go back, if we use then all this scenario that we produce for location, for different type of interannual variability, the first result we got are in this plot where I'm showing the box plot obtained from the 200 years for the different location, for the different type of interannual variability. So we see here that precipitation, when we increase or decrease interannual variability, change a lot, is a standard deviation. Here you cannot see, the first two are equal because you cannot see memory in this plot, but the second will have long memory. But so it's the case for all the site in precipitation, but when we look to gross primary production or evapotranspiration, basically it's almost the same box plot everywhere. Especially for UMBS, you can see that if you increase or decrease, at the end it doesn't change that much. The black point are the observation from the flux tower, that sometimes it's not exactly the same climate, so it's why it's not in the mean. But the only one that is preserving a bit this variability we impose, it's the Lucky Hills, the most dry one. So the rest of the presentation will be to understand why this is the case, this type of insensitivity. So we ask ourselves how we are doing in terms of global relationship. Our point, simulated point, are following on the line of, for instance, above ground net primary production versus precipitation. And so the point are following in the line of all these data set were keep together and together also with the relationship the author estimates. The only one, it's UMBS, it's a bit higher, but it's a forest. These sites are mostly for grassland, and these 2 points are Harvard forest. So basically, we are very similar in UMBS, so we test that data is okay. So, but if we take, so we have this global scale dependence, but then when we look to the single site, there is not much of a sensitivity. So what we did, we compute the sensitivity for each location from the data set and from our simulation. We got this plot that I'm going now to explain. Basically, in the x-axis, we have normalized sensitivity. Normalized sensitivity is basically the slope, the derivative of AMPP versus precipitation for each site. Each point is a site, normalized by the mean precipitation and mean annual AMPP. So basically, 1 means 1% change in precipitation, you have 1% change in above ground net primary production. So if we plot all these data points, the black dot are the simulation, and then we also plot what will be the sensitivity from global scale relationship. Obviously, at the beginning, you may ask, it's like a bit comparing apple and orange here. I would agree that in a steady state, it's the case. But when you think in terms of change, and sensitivity is typically a metric that you want to compute to understand how the system will react to a change, this is not anymore the case. And all these points, almost all these points are far below what will be the sensitivity from the global scale relationship. So if we analyze, basically we have a poor and not responsive, not much precipitation, but very low sensitivity, rich and not responsive, as we expected. They have enough rain, they are not going to respond too much. And they have poor and responsive, but have very few points. And these are Sevilleta, in some place in Mongolia, and I think also Kalahari is in this area. But, and we see that if we perturb interannual variability, our black dot, we change sensitivity, but not that much. Obviously, this result of difference between global relationship and single site is not totally new. Was already stated a long time ago by Gower and Prince, and also Axman, or more recently this was stated, maybe not in this frame, but very similar conclusion. Were reached, and then we don't even need the models here because we have the data point. But where we need the models, we say we can do the same for evapotranspiration. If we think to global scale relationship of evapotranspiration, obviously we are thinking to Boudicca's curve. This is the Boudicca's curve where we have our foresight coming from the simulation. And I also plot a series of points that are coming from a database of flux towers. So this is a database that is collecting all the flux towers. They have data. So we see a scattered, much more scattered in comparison to for instance, when you do Boudicca's curve from catchment scale analysis. But still, we are more or less there, except the viral range, but it's known that Mediterranean sites are fairly below the expected ET due to seasonality. Can we estimate the same in terms of sensitivity of the single site? The problem of flux tower that the number of years, it's very small. So it's not robust to estimate the sensitivity too much. It's more the median, it's about 4 years in this database. So what we did, we used our model simulation for making a sort of derivation, again, of a sensitivity. So in the left side, we have a mean ET versus mean precipitation. This is nothing else than a rearrangement of Budiko's curve. So you have this relationship between ET and precipitation, mean precipitation. Each point is a site, and obviously it depends on potential evapotranspiration. So as you increase potential evapotranspiration, you change the type of relationship. This is analytically coming from Budiko's curve. But then when you compute for each site the local sensitivity, so the single site sensitivity, and you compute this again, it's a normalized sensitivity. 0.4 means 1 change percent precipitation, it's 0.4% change in ET. We see that these are the expected curve from global scale relationship, and these are our sensitivity from the simulation. We see that all the site, even lucky yields, there is very high sensitivity as expected for a semi-arid system, but it's below what will be expected from global scale relationship. Only Zurich is getting to the point when we perturb interannual variability. Then we look to the sensitivity to the variance. So how ET and MPP mean change to the change in the variance of precipitation, and we found all negative values, though, so there is a little bit of nonlinear relationship between the two, but these values are very small. So it's basically 20 to 40 times smaller, the sensitivity in comparison to the sensitivity of the mean. So changing in the variance is not going to affect much the change in the mean, maybe not surprisingly. But then when we analyze the sensitivity of interannual variation of ET and GPP to basically the sensitivity of the variance to change in the variance. So I plot the coefficient of variation of precipitation in the x-axis and the y coefficient of variation of ET and GPP. You see that mostly are like basically very flat line except for lucky yields. So there is an insensitivity also to the variance. So it's more the case 3, total insensitivity except for the case of lucky yields that I was showing. When we look at the memory of the system, here it's a lag1 autocorrelation of precipitation GPP-ET for the 4th site. Here we see that when we impose long memory, we are increasing a lot the correlation of precipitation. So basically the red cross here. But this correlation that we impose in precipitation is totally filtered out by the system, except in one case, except in the case of lucky yields. They ask to preserve this correlation we impose because it's basically more force constrained by the system. It's also nice to see that viral range increased correlation for GPP in comparison to precipitation due to memory in the carbon pools of vegetation of that grassland. So we ask, why are site level AMPP and ET insensitive to local variation? So for a given established vegetation that you have in place, ET and MPP, we tried to correlate with many metrics within the year, with many different variables. We tried to understand what was explaining actually this interannual variability. It's not the bulk precipitation, what it is. We define at the end the metrics. There is good days and good hours. There are the days and the hours in a year. They have ET larger than the 95 percentile of the observational period. So if you define it instead of 95, 90, or 85, it doesn't change that much. So good hours and good days, it's a very difficult metric to define in the sense that it's a concurrence of many processes. You have high soil moisture, favorable vapor pressure deficit, wind speed, and temperature. And the random occurrence of this period within a year of very good hours where ET is very large is controlling annual ET much better than other variables. So good hours are explaining a much larger correlation with annual ET. This box plot is coming from the 16 cases we ran in the simulation. The good days. Then growing season control, this I will define in one slide what it is, but was defined by Stoy and Cotter, and that much better definitely than annual precipitation or even growing season precipitation. It's almost the same of annual one. And these good days, actually good hours are accounting for between 20 to 40% of annual total of ET. So this is the seasonal control that was defined by Stoy. We also found there is a good explanation of, in this case, the growing season, but annual ET will be the same. So it's the product of precipitation, vapor pressure deficit, leaf area index, and stomatal conductance during the growing season. This basically product is a better explanation than any of the single variable. It works in every site, but not as well as good days or good hours are doing. So if we compare good days, good hours, these are correlating very well with the anomalies that you have in annual ET. And also for GPP, even if good days or good hours are computed on ET. So this is not in contradiction with the well-known relationship of Orton index versus humidity index. So as you get dry, you have that vegetation is using water better. So you increase basically the Orton index. This is found in all the simulation. So I forgot to say each point here is 1 year of the simulation with the 4 scenarios of interannual variability. So each point, there are 800 points in this plot. So except for lucky yields where Orton index is almost always equal to 1. So this is not in contradiction with this increase in capability of using water from vegetation as you get drier. So getting to my conclusion, we show that the sensitivity to precipitation mean it's much larger than sensitivity to precipitation variance or memory. So basically, as a result, increase or decrease of interannual variability are mostly filtered out. The local sensitivity of ET and MPP, these are rather different, smaller than the sensitivity that you will expect across location from global relationship. Obviously, these are some implications, because if you perturb the system and the system is in its measured state, it can undergo to very small change. But when you lead time that the system readjusts, it goes to a different type of change in species competition or invasion, then you will have a much stronger sensitivity in the long term from what you will expect. So I think it's not only that a drastic change from grassland to forest. I'm also speaking it's a really smooth change, even with simple reorganization of the forest itself. Then we show that short temporal time scale are good days and good hours are a good control of interannual variability of ET and MPP. So they are basically determining the annual anomalies, the occurrence of this period, and the predictability, since it's mostly could be affected by this short temporal scale, it's difficult, more difficult than to predict how this short temporal scale are going to change in comparison to change in the mean annual precipitation or growing season precipitation. So with this, I got to my conclusion, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Simone. Questions? Amilcare.
Yeah. What I was mentioning in the slide when we did the study for global land precipitation, we showed that the short-term memory of the system it's very small, so it's almost equal to 0. But then when you impose long memory, you force externally long memory, you get basically long memory and also a bit more of a short-term correlation that you don't find in the data. Actually, that's true. Was to understand if the system would have some change due to this type of long memory is not just the lag one of the correlation. It's a series. Basically, it's like extending or more the period of drought or very wet period. Now I was simplifying and showing only the lag one correlation at the end. But was to understanding if this type of behavior has an effect on the overall the system and was able to change ET and MPP. It's not just related to the lag one correlation that I agree. We also found that worldwide it's very weak. You have some correlation in some semiarid system, but worldwide it's very weak.
So in relation to this is also my second point is the groundwater memory may be as important as the one of rainfall or more. And so how do you treat groundwater in the model? How do you calculate that?
These are all plot scale analysis where we didn't account for, we set a certain depth of the soil that depends on the system, it changed in the different flux tower according to what we observe in the field, but we didn't treat a system of groundwater dependent in explicit manner. But I agree that could be that could be provide a lot more of memory in the system. I agree.
Thank you. Other questions? I thought it was up to him. Okay, Danny, go ahead.
I was wondering about the Bodico curve. You explained the different space filling lines that you can have under the curve. And you, I don't think, or maybe I didn't get it. Of course, vegetation will be a big player in along which line you'll go in the Bodico curve, in the catchment or whatnot. So can you comment a little bit about what do you think are the explanatory variables in that context? For example, we've seen some talks this morning on vegetation patterns and so on, how this will map into your conclusions.
So we use the Bodico curve I use mostly to make the point of the difference in sensitivity between the local scale and what would be expected in global scale. So I just almost take for granted that Bodico will work, basically. That was the underlying assumption. But that has been a study, including the one I quoted, that demonstrate that basically you are not following perfectly the Bodico's curve, especially when you look at flux towers or, let's say, plot scale analysis. It's more scattered than catchment scale. But there they show that the controls are coming not only from the different type of vegetation, but also from the seasonality of the rainfall within the year and from the type of partition between basically snow and rain. And these type of things are all influencing, so you can go a little bit up and down in that plot. I agree.
Yeah, but then what kind of sensitivity can you derive from this?
That will be the sensitivity that I would expect from the global scale relationship, that even if it can change, that will not be so dramatic as the change that we saw when we analyzed the local sensitivity. So I agree that if I use a slightly different curve, I use the original Bodico. If I use a Bodico fit a bit different, I will get a slightly different. I fully agree on that. But I will still argue that that point we have, they are below that curve. So the local sensitivity is still less than the one you are fitting through your points. But there is uncertainty on that. But I was trying to make, paradoxically, it's more difficult to have independent measure of annuality to derive sensitivities than not for annual above ground net primary production, for instance.
Christina, you had a question. But microphone, please. Turn it on.
So complicated. Kind of following up on this question, I wonder, since your correlations with good days are so much better, how much of those, whether something is a good day, depends on not just the seasonality of precipitation, but the timing. I mean, we know that if you have a lot of rainfall that happen in big storm events, right, much of that gets lost as runoff, right? So, and that's the thing we worry about, because with global climate change, there's this trend towards more intense precipitation. So I wonder if you've looked at how much of your good days are explained by the within-the-year distribution of precipitation.
We didn't look explicitly yet to that, but different statistics of precipitation, or even within the year, were not correlating that well as really taking the good hours and good days. So it was difficult because everything is a bit correlated to each other. So annual precipitation is correlated with the good days. Certain seasonality of precipitation is correlated as well. So it's everything is a bit explained by everything else. But
of course. But I think it's an important thing to look at because it's something we know might change. Right, and I think you can extract it out sort of strategically if you look at in the growing season and similar to a Horton index type.
We can definitely make some division in event and look which type of event we get in the different years. That's definitely something we can do.
Nice talk.
Very good. Thank you again.